specific context, I wanted to know your opinion about this relative price of fossil fuels in the international economy going down and going up. There are fluctuations of that, which has a deleterious effect with respect to investment in renewable energies. And sometimes the relative price of energy, and sometimes when people make a case that, see, there should be no gasoline tax in advanced economies, as well as in our country also, there's a lobby which says that there should be no gasoline tax or it be reduced. It also works against this particular process. Along with that, I want to have another specific question to both of you, both to Nagahari as well as Tulka, with respect to this thing that when we speak about issues, we say that we create a mall, we increase our carbon footprint, and then we are trying to reduce it. Similarly, is a question of our public transport policy. It's extremely easy for us to own a private vehicle in India. There's a World Bank policy discussion paper with respect to Singapore, which speaks about the extent of disincentives it has towards purchasing a private vehicle. So private vehicle and at the same time public, can't we have some sort of a carbon credit thing by means of which is public transport and use of public transport in itself is subsidized? Because we are speaking about a billion population and not about an economy like Sweden, where we could have some sort of a carrot stick policy. With vis-a-vis we could achieve certain positive goals. And I would like to know Nagahari Krishna's thing also as to how a business model which could be applicable in the private sector could actually be extended towards the public domain. Because we have to think in terms of a larger objective of reduction of it.
Thank you. Would you like to start? Nagahari, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the market that happens in China to what I spoke about India, the way we look at it is, for us, India is as good a market as what China is. And the kind of investments that we want to bring into India from a global angle, I mean, they are looking at India in the same respect as what they look at China. And at times it becomes difficult for us to explain in our board meetings as to why are both the markets different. While having said that, in China probably it is much more easier in terms of for the government to drive policies, especially from when I look at it from the building codes, the energy conservation codes. And when I reflect back to what are the standards that China follows to what are the standards that are available centrally here, it is probably very similar. And in some places, our standards and our energy efficiency measures that we are asking for our own air conditioners or chillers are at a level higher than what it is in China. But the problem lies in what you said, and here we have something called as some things are they call them, these are state subjects and these are not central subjects. These will be led by municipalities. So the building codes, while they are being devised at the center, the implementation rests at the municipal level, and it becomes very difficult to implement it because we are the way we are, and there is a certain mechanism that works in India. And we do see that there is a positive traction that is happening there, and there is a lot of measures that the government is taking to drive that. So we are quite positive that these things will happen in the right way. The second aspect is that financing does play a role here. Even though all of this can come in, you can put the policies in place, but for energy efficiency to take off, the financing needs to come in, because we can't expect these small and medium enterprises to take off money from their cash flow and put it into these measures. So we need to understand how to bring in that aspect. In terms of your question, sir, as to what are the kind of business models that can work here, I think I mentioned about district cooling. I mean, that is definitely a way forward. But that's something that we have to understand both from a policy angle, and we need to change culturally. So it'll take time for us to get that into place. We need to understand that, like electricity, we can buy air conditioning. So those are some aspects. Like for water, if you see for an example, we are not willing to pay money for water. but we want water because we believe as a society that water is something that government has to provide for us. So that brings in its own inefficiencies. And one of the recent things that I can tell of is when the Honorable Energy Minister brought in this rule that all commercial establishments should look at fixing temperature at 24 degrees centigrade. Instead of taking a positive tonality to that, we saw a lot of negative feedback coming in a lot of areas, both from media and how can the government tell us what temperature we should maintain in our hotels or hospitals. The government is only enabling you to tell that that is the temperature that is required for us to be comfortable and healthy. Whether if you want to put your air conditioners at 16 degree, you're welcome to do it. But thank you.
Our clothing is endogenous to what you know Habitat Center is going to do. You haven't, you've deflected Amartu's question. Ulka. No, maybe later.
I don't think I have the answers to these questions. I'm going to just try to say a couple of things. So on the financing, there's very little money in the international climate framework, the UNFCCC sort of framework. The Green Climate, the Global Climate Facility, the GCF, is not sort of in good shape right now. So in some sense, domestic action is what will work. And so far, things have moved in the right direction with renewable energy, the solar prices falling. And in some sense, something similar is happening with electric vehicles as well. So with the domestic action itself, I think that trend is going to continue. I'm not very optimistic about international finance coming in either for adaptation or for mitigation. On gasoline taxes, what taxation like that does is, it's important to provide certainty, regulatory certainty, and it's important to provide some kind of price signals that drive innovation. So the kind of, work that Danfoss talked about, this is also linked to public transport. It's not just energy efficiency, but even just leveling the playing field. Not just public transport, but also making passive, cooling, building design attractive financially to builders and to buyers relative to, electricity consumption. So one reason why some of these things work well in China than in India is because actually the Chinese government is making some hard policy kind of choices. For example, it is actually going to adopt, to put in place an emissions trading scheme. So, again, this is not coming from the international framework. The US is out. There is no global carbon price. But domestic action is what is driving a lot of these movements and technological innovation as well.
Purnamita? And do you want to take the question also about pricing of vehicles and the price signals that Ulka talked about?
Thank you, Rajat. Actually, to first sort of come to the question you had raised, actually the problem with this whole climate issue is that it's so it's filled with confounding factors, so that by the time you ultimately feel the impact and trace it back and attribute it to climate change, it can be a long chain, right? So I think that's one of the issues. But I do think that, as Ulka said, that, no, I think the science is more or less reached a level of consensus now, and that we are on a trajectory of currently somewhere hitting between 3 and 4 very easily, even with the kind of pledges that we have seen with the Paris Agreement, and that we would probably need to work very hard because, as you very rightly said, India's pledges are seen, there have been categorization of the pledges, and India's pledges are seen to be in accordance with the maximum it could have done in terms of current commitment towards a 2 degree centigrade world, as opposed to many other countries, including those from the developed world, whose commitments have been seen to be, NDCs have been seen to be failing in sort of helping to achieve even a 2 degree centigrade target. But I think so what happens with the climate issue is we perhaps don't always see policy that is directly a climate policy, like a carbon tax or an ETS scheme or something, but willy-nilly, it's coming into our lives. And I will say that of late, I think, even in the Indian context, there is some recognition of this. So for instance, if you see what is happening under the National Clean Air Program, the draft for which is now out, and every state has been asked to make its own clean air program, you can see that there is a recognition that if you can bring down the non-carbon air pollutants, you do a lot for doing that little bit to cut out from the global warming, along with the obvious air pollution and health benefits. Consider the Finance Commission's devolutions to states. From the 12th, 13th, 14th, and now to the 15th, which I've been involved with to some extent. So there are these complex formulas that we've conventionally worked out on very different sorts of criteria: area, population, fiscal capacity, fiscal needs, so on and so forth. But from the 12th onwards, we saw grants for forests, recognizing that forests had an important ecological role to play, to the 14th Finance Commission actually bringing it in and giving it a 7.5% weightage in the devolution formula. And now we are actively actually engaged in some work where we would probably push it further a little bit to take into account other things. Similarly, now there is a draft that while deciding on the siting of any new power plants, one has to consider, conventionally we've always been to wherever the ore is and sited the thermal power plants there. Right? So now there is a thinking that we should actually take into account that in the planning process, you should also take into account any foreseeable and known changes in stream flows. And so because that is getting connected to what is happening on climate variability front. So I think willy-nilly it tends to come in and somewhere we wake up and take that into account, such as Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan as well. And now many cities have said, okay, let's adopt it. It's a forward-looking exercise. Regarding again, at the international level also, it comes in. So for example, if Europe levies an aviation cess, all of us pay the higher fares. So we don't get aviation cess because it calls it a green cess, so we all pay it, right? So I think willy-nilly these pricing issues, costing issues come into our lives. And I think I'll sort of leave it there. Can a country act alone? I think there's some connect here. If we go back to our lessons from the Clean Development Mechanism, the way, for instance, Brazil or China implemented versus the way India implemented it. So China, for instance, had made it mandatory that when a project was being submitted for the Clean Development Mechanism and was going to be implemented, it had to bring in technology transfer into it. It had to upgrade the technology to a more efficient technology for any industry in any sector. In India, we didn't do that. So we didn't see the technological upgradation matching the kind of CDM projects, although we did very well in terms of the financial flows that India got out of the CDM mechanism. So I think there is an inherent link between the two, and it's up to a country to decide how it sort of goes about it. And I would just say that, yes, there are these costing things going out, but isn't it also a reality that much of the funding today that flows for infrastructure, for other things, has started having this line in there about making it resilient to climate impacts. So infrastructure, if you consider infrastructure, if you consider the waste sector, if you consider wherever we are trying to get funds, most of the documentation on the international arena is bringing in the climate aspect.
Thank you. So we'll take one more round and then we'll have to, I'm afraid we'll have to close. So you'll have one question here, two, and then three. And we'll stop here. Professor. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. Given the urgency of the climate issue and the fact that the past trends, if we project it, we will never reach the target, given that very severe condition, that we are not going to make it, there is definitely a need to accelerate it. Now how? There are two ways, I think. One is, can the G20 work towards making climate technology a public good and do whatever is necessary to pursue this matter, because that has a lot of implications about the transfer of technology. And the second one is financing. Now in the previous section on financial architecture, special drawing rights were mentioned. These were issued in trillions of dollars when financial crisis was on. Can some of these special drawing routes be used to finance climate change, given the condition that we are in?
Thank you. Peach.
I think one of the two could respond.
Yes, I think either Purnamita or Ulka. Yes.
Dinesh Mohan from IIT Delhi. I've spent about 52 years of my life among engineers and scientists. And in my own field, the literature from the 50s and 60s told us that because of developments in science and technology, there will be no problems of pollution and congestion and accidents and traffic later. And we know the results. So sometimes I get the feeling that some engineers and scientists are a little more skeptical than non-scientists about the magic of technology. The question is that, one question is, do any of you even slightly sometimes have a doubt that technology is going to solve all these problems in the future? At all, sometime in the middle of the night. Do you ever have a doubt? Everything I hear and read is that there is no problem. It's going to be solved. Second is an issue of communication, which was mentioned, that we must have more communication. Teaching my students, I tell them, I don't have a problem with climate change because I'll be dead very soon. But you people are not going to be dead. But my students in IIT do not seem to be scared at all about climate change. Now, how do we make individuals be concerned, not Danfoss? So will communication involve something like telling people that if you go to a gym to improve your health, you're contributing to climate change instead of running in the park? Will we tell them that every time you own a summer home in the mountains or somewhere else, you're contributing to climate change instead of having just one home? Will we tell them that every time you order a chicken from whatever, chicken nuggets, or from something from Amazon, you're contributing to climate change? Do you think that kind of communication might help people push for things that all of you want to do, to aid technology to do it?
Thank you. There's one last question here.
Good evening, I'm Prantik from TERI. My question is, like you rightly mentioned, that there is a shortage of financing and investments for renewable energy. How well do you think a policy, something like collecting a hotelier's rent, so that the more we exhaust the renewable resources, non-renewable resources, we generate a kind of a fund, more like a green fund that goes up, and it eventually adds to the investment which we can make in future for the renewable resources. I just want to know, like, if such a solution would actually be successful or not.
Okay, so I leave it to the panelists to pick and choose the questions. Would you like, Mr. Krishna? Or can I go in the, reverse order? Ulka, would you like to? And then I'll come to you.
So maybe I'll restrict myself to the two questions about, do you have a doubt that technology will solve problems? I thought, well, every day, all the time. I didn't want to be overly negative in my presentation, given the theme of this session. But certainly, technology is what we make of it. The problem is that it's not enough to be able to just say that technology, the application of technology is context dependent. We need to be able to find solutions. But there is a book which I like very much called Geek Heresy. It's by somebody called Kentaro Toyama. He used to work for Microsoft Research. And it's really a debunking of a lot of these myths that technology will solve. And basically his thesis is that technology amplifies the capacities that already exist within society. And also that it's not a democracy. It's not one person, one vote. It's $1, one vote in the marketplace. And technology comes in packages, big or small, and the market just sort of exacerbates inequities that already exist in terms of accessing technology. So certainly there are huge problems. I just alluded to some of them very cryptically when I talked about the trade-offs that are involved. And for example, we take great pride in having the largest solar farm set up in Ladakh. But what was there? Was it wasteland? Was it people who were using that for pasture? What was the biodiversity over there? We're not really asking these questions in the way we use technology. The second issue about communication, I'm actually more optimistic than you, because if you go talk to farmers, for example, they will tell you about climate change. You don't have to tell them what the scientific trends are. They will tell you. And also in terms of students, I find millennials, as they are called, I mean, this is a bit of a generation gap again. They're very environment conscious. They're vegan, they're cycling. So I think sometimes, it's a sort of a sample bias. And I have actually great hope that the younger generations will be far more environmentally conscious and sustainable than we have been, or the previous generations have been. I don't think we need. I don't know if we'll be able to communicate with them in their language, but they will find their way.
Purnavita?
Thanks. Yeah, just picking and choosing again. I agree completely. Yes. So that was my idea of. Sort of, can there be technology hubs, for instance, which can be set up across countries? I don't know if G20 is the right forum. I'm no expert on that, or some other such ideas. I'm completely in agreement with your suggestions to take it forward. In terms of communication, the communication issue, yes, I think I would be more optimistic about the younger generations. I think the problem is that there's an overall far more consumptive culture which hits all of us across generations. And I think it would be for me, it would be unfair to sort of single out and target the younger generations, or maybe I just meet like-minded people, I don't know. But I, by and large, think that they are a generation which is very open to sensitization. It is up to us to be able to do that sensitization and communication. In terms of doubts about technology, yes, of course. I would always say that technology does not by itself solve any problems. And this is nothing new. From the first hearing aids that were sort of discovered to where we are today, we know that those hearing aids never took off till you actually tried them on people and they told you. And that wasn't just a lab kind of experiment. Today we know that crop simulation exercises in labs give you one kind of results. When you go out to the field, they give you completely different sorts of results. So even at a biophysical level, technology doesn't work in an isolation. And when you take it out of the biophysical context, of course it gets more complex, and yes, obviously. But I do also feel at the same time that there is sufficient evidence to tell us that if we get our technology right, we can solve problems. And there is enough evidence, including evidence from sociologists and anthropologists who have told us that some technologies, for example, the mobile cell technology and other such technologies, have managed to overcome issues like elite capture, bring down power asymmetries in many places. So there is technology and there is technology. Technology by itself, whether it will succeed in solving human problems, is a different issue. Thank you.
Nagari, just be brief.
Yeah. No, on technology, I think one example that I can clearly give you is, while you quoted the gym example, the other example I can look at is what we did with the Montreal Protocol. When we knew that the ozone is depleting because of air conditioners and other refrigerants, with the Montreal Protocol, we not only continue to use these kind of equipment like an air conditioner or mobile air conditioning, but we have increased it. But at the same time, technology has been able to not only solve, but in a way reverse the ozone depleting. So to me, technology will definitely solve it. And if I take the example of, let's say, mobile phones, we can't expect children to stop using mobile games. I mean, they will use more and more of mobile games, while it may be, we can advise them as much that go play in the ground. So we need to understand how do we use technology. And the second one, as regards financing, I think one of the things that we have been talking about is if we can have some kind of a bank which can only look at energy efficiency financing, and there have been discussions that we have heard of from the ministry that they are looking at putting in something on those lines. Thank you. Thank you,
Nagari. Thank you. I think this has been a great session, and I'm going to choose discretion as the better part of valor and not try and summarize what was said, but I'll just make 3 very quick points, since we are going to go into the next session very shortly. One is that obviously it will be very nice for the G20 countries to collaborate and cooperate on climate change, and for countries like India to be the beneficiaries of technology and financial transfer. And that's perhaps, as I understand from the panelists, it's unlikely to happen in the near term, given the state of global affairs. So, technology transfer, financial transfer, unlikely to happen. And at the G20 level, we still need to be able to sort of push the envelope on climate change, given that the science is more or less settled. So can we have a carve-out, which is what I said right in the beginning, can India and China begin to cooperate much in the sort of way that was mentioned in the morning? Can we have an Asian monetary fund, or can we have, things that could be able to be shock absorbers within the region? So can India and China come together and address some of the issues? And third and final point is that, we need to do all this for ourselves. A lot of the things that we need to do will provide climate as a co-benefit, and we really need to do it for ourselves. So we'll get those benefits, and if we get, our domestic policies around renewables, maybe around carbon pricing, if we get those right, do the recycling mechanism, we'll be able to make a difference locally and hopefully overcome some of the risks or vulnerabilities in the agriculture sector that the panelists spoke about. But I think it's been a fascinating, I've learned a lot from this session. You've been a wonderful audience and a restrained audience. Only once was the Frisbee mentioned in the panel. So it's been really nice, and I'd like to thank the panelists, and I would like you to give them a big round of applause. Thank you all very much. So we'll take just about, Prateek, 5 minutes for a changeover. Prateek, would you want to make the announcement?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, panelists. So we'll break for we're running slight delay. We'll break for 5 minutes, and then we'll be back with the much-awaited annual G20 address by Usha Thorat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was really nice. We should meet up sometime.